Hello, I'm Alice Hiller. Welcome you all very warmly to Chaucer Cameron and Jeffrey Sugarman's Voicing Our Silences workshop. Before I hand over to these two brilliant poets, I'll share a few words about their work. Published by Against the Grain, Chaucer's debut, In an Ideal World, I'd Not Be Murdered, is powerful and timely in the here and now of March 2021. Following the murders of Sarah Everard and others, the topic of violence against vulnerable and undefended peoples around the world is uppermost in many of our minds. An uncompromising poet and poetry filmmaker with a deeply felt and courageous sense of purpose. In addition to her page publications, Chaucer created the international poetry film project, Wild Whispers. She also curates and presents poetry film everywhere from Houston and Athens to Berlin and Bath Spa University. Her bio, like Jeff's, is on the link. Calling to mind the project of J. Barnard's Surge, the poems of In an Ideal World, I'd Not Be Murdered, perform the voices of a group of women working as prostitutes in London in the early 1980s, when the gentrification of the rundown areas around King's Cross seemed unimaginable. Speaking to each other, reflecting on clients, remembering their poignant, defiant, individual histories, these women take us to a place where outside the road is eerie, street corners are calling, you're hunched inside a doorway, behind you lights still strobe, as I will leave you for a moment to trade recalls. Many of the poems are anchored by the names of their speakers, Caprice, Eve, Morgan, Grace, in acts of witness. In cartoons, Peyton reveals how she took her mind back to the Flintstones during a violent assault by a dodgy punter, leading to Hell, a Broken Nose. Central to Chaucer's sequence is Crystal. Her wisecracking, self-defining story is a steady reclamation of possibility all the way to its final full stop. While the poems don't look away from selling sex and the personal costs of this rough trade, they also encompass the harms and the predators which can set people up for working in this field. Notwithstanding their grounding in real, difficult materials, Chaucer's poems are always made works. Their sound patternings, imageries, and formal structures allow their readers and listeners to become an active participant through the play of art. All the poems Chaucer will read in this workshop deal with adult themes. Hina Needs Swabbing also bears witness to specific injuries. Chaucer will cue this poem with a warning so people can turn off their sound and adjust the captions if they need to, then raise her hand again to signal the reading is finished. While Chaucer's work grows out of the UK, her workshop partner, Jeffrey Sugarman, is an American-born poet living in London. Memories of the wildernesses of his native Florida followed him into a career in architecture and urban design in New York City. He moved to London in 2009 with his English husband. Jeff's debut, Dear Friends, was published by the Emma Press in 2019 and explores the webs of connection that help form our identities, while elegizing lost times and places that we carry within us. Like Chaucer's compelling poems, Jeff's urgent, tender work also resists silence and silencing. He interrogates the wordlessness that can arise from long-form grieving, whether for growing up in a family whose centre was peopled by absences, or living with the memories of those lives ended prematurely through the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Beginning in a Florida of whispers behind doors, valanced curtains, his mother in hospital unmoving, and travelling towards bodies chafing on the blades of St. Augustine grass, as in the poem Second Harvest, Jeff questions the conventions of heteronormativity to ask what love means and how it may be found. Through a Whitman-like embedding in the physical, the poems also contrast the repressions and denials of previous generations of queer lives with the gradual openings that have followed. They refer to sexual themes as part of their reclamatory voicing of long imposed silences. It's now my great honour to hand you over to Chaucer Cameron and Jeffrey Sugarman, and I'd like to thank them both for giving us their time, their work and their creativity.
Hi, I'm Chaucer, and I'm going to be reading from my pamphlet, In an Ideal World, I'd Not Be Murdered. Okay. And thank you everybody for being here as well. It's great to see you all. I'm going to start with this poem, called The Green, because it's relevant to recent events that have been going on recently in the last few days. The Green. The bus stopped at the edge of the green. It was a dark winter evening. Ellen still had a 20-minute walk home. Bears, wild boars maybe. That rustling crack closing in must be animal. It took 3 days to discover the body. Reporters said it was hard to identify. Devoured, mostly. Okay. The next poem is the first poem in the pamphlet, and it's called 128 Farley Road. I find him at the bottom of the stairs. The strange thing is, his eyes are blue with flecks of grey. I could have sworn they were brown, a dull sort of brown, but then again, the mask, which often hid his eyes and always hid his face. Apart from one time years ago when I caught him naked and alone. Now in death, that face looks so serene, clean almost. I'd often worried that the rubber marks on his jawline, forehead and just beneath his eyes would pit his skin so deep he'd be scarred for life. But here we are, just he and I, gazing at each other, the way dead people do when caught together intimately. One thing troubles me. I say this in a whisper, so not to disturb the dust that's gathered. How did this come to be? This flat, these walls, they're crawling with dead girls. I know the rules, no names, no dates, just numbers. I'll teach you how to switch blades. You know I carry switchblades like the way you wear stilettos. When Crystal told stories, I learned to keep quite still. I knew she wouldn't mean to, but she'd lash me with her tongue if I so much as hinted she was wrong. You know I carry switchblades, she said, then paused to judge effect. You know I've never liked you. You think you're something special, but you're nothing really, are you? You're just like the rest of us. I've heard you with the punters. You're no escort. You're a whore. Coup de Maître, which translates as masterstroke or genius, is a poem that explores power dynamics played out between punter and escort. Coup de Maître. I lay you on your back, twist off your claw legs, crack them with a heavy implement. I will not allow you to shatter into small pieces yet. I will extract the bones of you, place them with care into a metal bowl. I will insert thumbs on the base of your body, push upwards and to release you from your carapace. I will pull away and discard your lungs. They're only dead man's fingers. You know them intimately, don't you? I will press your mouth with such force that it snaps from its shell. I will raid your stomach sack, cut you in half, scoop out the meat of you, fork out the white from your carcass, and you will be left hollow. Your cavities will shimmer thinly, rocking back and forth, open, empty, ready to be stuffed, dressed, and put on show. And then we will dine. You will be picked, handheld, lifted high on a fork, ready to be savoured by tongue, swallowed down into the gut where you'll rest for a moment before clawing your way back through every orifice imaginable. Introductions. Introductions gives the reader a glimpse into one of the characters' lives, Crystal's life, her past and present and potential future, if she has one even. And we get an idea of how and why she got to where she is. I need to give a content warning because the poem mentions abortion and suicide. It mentions it. It doesn't go into graphic detail, but it mentions it. And the following poem, which is Hina Needs Hobbing, as Ali said, also needs a trigger warning. And I'll raise my hand when I've read both poems to show you that it's okay to come back in if you need to mute. Introductions. Night, a dimly lit street, an almost empty cafe, dull, bland interior, brown wooden chairs, a brown leather sofa, a dark brown top chair in the corner. A male waiter with scraggy, scrape-back hair stands behind the counter. Crystal is sitting by the window of the cafe while another woman sits on the floor at her feet. A young woman lies asleep, slumped on a broken, battered beanbag at the back of the room. She's covered up her legs with an ochre cardigan. "That's Jane," said Crystal, pointing towards the sleeping woman. J-A-E-N. Not Jane with a Y or even plain Jane, but J-A-E-N. For God's sake, talk about making life hard. Crystal likes a cigarette. "Jane Foster," she calls herself. "Look, she's even got it tattooed on her knuckles. I had a daughter once. She was fostered. Well, she was for a while. I was only allowed to see her on Saturdays. And then I found out some oh so nice adoptive family got her. She's not fostered, she's adopted. And her name is anyone's guess. Anonymous. Anonymous. It won't be the name I gave her though, will it? They won't tell me what it is, her name I mean. I'll never know what they chose until she's old enough to find me, if she even bothers, will I? And then I'll have to wait. And even then she'll still be anonymous, barely there. Anyway, there she is, That's Jane Foster, Jaen. Crystal gets up and stretches and orders a coffee just for herself. You weren't here when she turned up last week, were you? She was in the right state, told us some story that she'd sort of had a baby, a miscarriage, abortion, can't remember which, whatever, the fetus ended up in the dustbin. Is that a criminal offence? I mean, if it's flushed down the toilet, no one will be any the wiser, would they? Just a cramp or two, a bleed, a full stop. It's not hard. It's not that hard to flush a fetus down the loo unless you listen to that claptrap from the pro-life lot, the ones that make you feel like shit. They stand there with their banners, with their slimy little posters, and the way they call them babies, little people, small humans, beating hearts. And yeah, I guess, how could you really flush a little beating heart down the toilet and not commit suicide when you can't live with the flashbacks? Hina needs swabbing and left to hang. As I've said, this next poem needs trigger warning. I'll indicate with my hand when to unmute. And this poem has a companion poem, which is not in the pamphlet. The companion poems, which I call internal songs, are the voices of survivors, and they're there to enable expressions of agency and autonomy. And I want to show the darkest poem against the lightest poem. Hina needs swabbing. Hina's cheek tonight. She's been damaged. There are tears in her silicone, cracks around her genitals. She's done well. She's lasted 6 months, but her left breast has a puncture. Her hips are overstretched, anus slightly ruptured. She was favoured by a trainee gynecologist who used her every Monday, and now he wants a change. She was specially designed for him, marked with his initials. She has no teeth or tongue, but a flicker on both nipples. She'll orgasm when you come. Hina says nothing. She hangs naked from her hook. Then I hear a dog fox call. It could have been a deer or canine bitch, a distant screech of feral feline hitched by skin and claw, hung up this way. The land is turned, and high above a felled again Stygian sky, starless I, this landscape am. Dog rows tagged and bordered by a brook, wide as any river, vast as all the seas. Hear me, for I am feral feline deer and canine bitch. The distant screech of left to hang will come unhitched. And that's it. That's it. Thank you. Okay.
So, thank you, Chaucer. You know, as powerful as those poems are on the page, the readings are really rather ghastly, astonishing. I've always loved the way you read your poems, and it's a huge pleasure to hear them tonight. And it's a huge pleasure to be here to celebrate the launch of your pamphlet, and especially at this moment. Well, I think Alice has already said much about the current moment and the issues of women in prostitution and women in general in the world. So the pamphlet, just displays the gender power plays and exploitation in such an effective, poetic way. They're really like dramatic monologues, and I was really struck by that now. So I'd also like to just intervene and give my public thanks to Alice for putting these together. The conversations we've had, as we were saying earlier, have just been incredibly illuminating.
Yeah.
And I feel very privileged to have done this. And Alice was so astute in seeing that while the tones of our two pamphlets are quite different, and the specific people, characters that populate them are different, there is quite a lot in common in terms of the hidden, voiceless people. So there are several features that seem key to your work to me, among them the depersonalization of the individual and the desire to rectify that. And you do that effectively with numbering, masks, a focus on surfaces like the stilettos and the like, and namelessness and naming, which you do in a number of the poems. 128 Farley Road is really effective in that way. It's such a great opener. So I'd like to start, because you have said to me how important it is to you, asking you about place, because it's important in both of our collections. And yours, I think, place actually has power over the speaker and her characters. And it seems that place and home particularly confer and communicate to the reader. We infer very much from that. So I was wondering if you could talk about that in relation to your pamphlet's concept and how it came to you and its general development.
Yeah, I can. Thanks, Jerry. Yeah, I can. It's a pleasure to be here and be able to talk about these things. I think they're important. It's interesting that you actually mention home, because the concept of place is significant. Place names and areas come up a lot in my poems, and in particular, women's names and the naming of things is important. They act as emphasis and placeholders, which that came to be as we've chatted through, and that's been really interesting. But regarding the concept of home itself, my relationship to home has always been very problematic and slippery. I don't feel at home anywhere. And ironically, home is not easy to place. I think that might be the name of a poem. I'll come back to that in a moment, if I may. But in terms of the book's general development, I say it developed over a long period of time, partly because traumatic experiences are often received in delay, and it took over 30 years or more to achieve, for me, the emotional distance that was needed to be able to reflect through these events in my poetry. So it took that time. And one of the book's starting points to discuss more about the sort of development was I wrote a monologue called The Raid, based on a police raid on a brothel in 1978 in Streatham, hosted by Cynthia Payne. And Cindy was a madam. She was my madam for a bit. Cynthia's life was made into a film called Personal Services. Julie Waters played the part of Cynthia. I'm sure she had great fun with Cindy. And then more recently, in 2016, I found myself writing a poem called Brothel Keeping in Suburbia. And that seemed to come from nowhere. It came, one of those poems that comes all at once, so that came from nowhere. And then I joined a writing group in London, which was based near my old haunts by coincidence. So names like Farley Road, Clissold Park, King's Cross, Canary Wharf are places I know well, and they're mentioned in the poems. This geographical space inspired more poems than I felt at home, but by that I mean it was a familiar place. The familiarity of the place inspired my writing rather than any feeling of home, and I was able to start writing for the pamphlet. There were two other events that pushed the book forward in terms of process and development. One was hearing that Cynthia Payne had died in 2015, and that was a very freeing situation in terms of censorship and self-censorship, because you don't talk about things when those people are alive or around, because they'll threaten you with death. So I kept very quiet about stuff until she died. And then the other event which moved the book forward was finding out about the suicide of my psychotherapist, who worked in a hospital setting. He was in a hospital setting, and the police told me relatively recently that he died in the 80s. They found him and he died in the 80s. Although the therapy with him had been sexually abusive, I actually encountered sexual abuse, or the cover-up of sexual abuse, in every single organisation I came into contact with. Every single organisation that I came into contact with, there was either sexual abuse or the cover-up of sexual abuse. And this had a significant impact on my writing. The constant repetition and being witness to systemic abuse and the enforced silence that always followed, keep quiet, don't say anything, and nobody will believe you. But ironically, you know, we are voicing our silences right now. I mean, how amazing is that? That's amazing. So from going from enforced silence to being able to speak. And those experiences informed much of my writing. The hidden nature of abuse is experienced as fragmentation, which is in my lyric voice form. And I guess that the narrative, and this is quite new to me, only recent weeks while I've been doing my pamphlet and stuff, and since it's been published, I guess the narrative form which I've used in the book is a way of bringing the fragmentation together into a more coherent and cohesive body of work. So the above experiences have been a significant driving force behind much of my work, and it informs my writing practice a lot. At the time, there was literally nowhere for me to go, nowhere, everywhere was blocked. So I just went into my writing because that's the only safe place that I had. And it's difficult to say, I suppose, but to a certain extent, that still applies today. There's still been things that have happened recently with abuse, and I cannot share that. So it's still going on today, that repetition, because I've got nowhere to go with it. I couldn't possibly say too much about that. So, but anyway, so that's how, in an ideal world, I'd Not Be Murdered came into being. That's the long answer.
Well, thank you. Let's hope an ideal world comes into being sometime sooner rather than later. Yeah, I'm so glad that you read that last poem, Left to Hang. I hadn't seen it, I don't think, before this evening. Though we had talked, as you said, about your sort of more frequent style of lyric poetry. The fragmentation, and it really is so different from the other narrative poems in the pamphlet, although I don't find it any less powerful, but it does a very different thing, obviously, but it just made me bristle. And I'm fascinated about what you were saying about fragmentation as a consequence of trauma and having to hide, because I feel that so much in my own work, and we'll talk about that later. But I wanted to go on and then ask you about one of my favorite poems, which is Coup de Maître. It just struck me so powerfully when I first read it, because not only is it a sort of, well, spine-chilling narrative, it's just an accomplished construction of extended metaphor. And I particularly admire the ambiguity that you maintained throughout as to who is the diner and who's going to be dinner. Yeah, it's sort of grand guignol. It's really just a fantastic poem, and it's such a moment in the pamphlet, I think. So could you tell us a little bit more about that poem particularly?
Well, I now know more about it since I've been chatting to you, which has been really great. I know a lot more about it. It is Cryptomet was a strange poem to write and to live with, and I think it's an example of a sort of ever-evolving poem. It's slippery, ambiguous, multi-layered, which you mentioned, and it seems to change with every reading, and I'm getting to know more and more about it. And that was really interesting. It was a challenge chatting to you about things. And so it's not surprising that it's a poem that explores power dynamics, and it does that specifically within the context of prostitution. The power dynamics in prostitution is different to power dynamics, I believe, elsewhere. There are similarities, but it's very specific to prostitution. Zoe Brigley, who endorsed the book, says there are moments of laughter and even negotiations for power. And indeed there are, all the strategies I've employed in the poem, such as enjambment, white space, similes, the word choice, they serve to flag up the nature of power interactions, and the toing and froing back and forth. I'll do this to you, I'll do that to you, you do this and that. That power dynamic in prostitution has always intrigued me to the point of I know where I first picked it up, in the Hilton. I remember where I first noticed it most. And so the way it shifts, the way power shifts, and I tend to compare that power dynamic to a virus, which is, can see it in the virus. It's oppressive, it's contagious, it mutates and transfers from one body to another. And that is why I chose to read, change my set. So I chose to read I'll Teach You How to Switch Blades, because Coupe de Met is an example of seeing that transference in action. In Switchblades, Crystal becomes the holder of power. She becomes the oppressor. And so it goes like, so it transfers from one body to another, which is the most difficult part of prostitution and the saddest part and the most dangerous part, I think. And so she does to others what has been done to her. And so she becomes the oppressor. So I have to ask myself, where does that power lie in prostitution? What does it look like? How does it feel? But where does it lie? And how does it operate? And I explore these issues in this poem, and I'll continue to explore it through poems like Coupe de Met, or chatting to people about it. Yeah, so that's a bit about the power dynamic within that industry.
Yeah. I really love the, well, love may not be the right word. I really admire, want to steal it, the metaphor of a virus. I hope you'll write that poem, I think. I'm especially drawn to it because it embodies the power dynamic in a way, without being the bodies of the actual people. So that's fascinating. So I think maybe I'll, because you wanted to talk about it so much, and understandably, as a poem in itself, it's fascinating and really effective, but it meant a lot to you in terms of writing the pamphlet, as I understand. And that's 128 Farley Road, the opening poem. The last line of which I think is sort of, just sums up the whole poem. No names, just numbers. Yeah, if you could talk to us a little bit about that poem particularly, and specificity of place and the anonymity of numbers where they collide together.
It's really, yeah, that's been quite eye-opening as well, because I'm dyscalculic, was it? If you don't get on with numbers, I'm dreadful at numbers. So, and it's interesting that numbers come up so much. I swapped manuscripts with Sharon Moscovich, because we're launching with the Against the Grain, and it transpired Sharon and I had the same road in common, but for different reasons. And we both know the same area, and we even both know the sort of similar people and all sorts of things, you know. Anyway, this coincidence prompted me to look up Farley Road again, which was difficult. I didn't want to do it, but I discovered the road only went up to 124. So how did I get 128, you know? So for a short while, it felt like it didn't exist. And I worked out why later, but that's another story. The building's on the corner, so it's on the corner, so it's in a different road, but you know. But this incident flagged up issues of visibility and invisibility, and that plays out in my poems too. And so in effect, the disappeared house became a heterotopic space, which by definition reflects the experience of prostitution, and probably led to a little bit of PTSD and a flashback and a bit of a troubled evening when I couldn't find that building. And I realized suddenly it wasn't anything to do with the building, you know. It was because it was like, you know, the experience of prostitution, and I'll explain a bit of that. A body that is for sale has to perform visibility and invisibility at the same time. It has to be on show, and it has to stay hidden in plain sight. It operates at night. It rarely sees the sun. It never stores up enough vitamin D, and it often can't reveal what it does to friends, family, children, husbands, or even itself, while remaining available at all times. So I'd argue really that the sex industry as a whole is a heterotopic space. It's a liminal area where people cross back and forth from one world to another. And it's quite an achievement. You have to be really strong. So, you know, and prostitution, you know, it's not a weak thing to be involved with, really. In many ways, you have to, because of the dissonance involved. There's so much dissonance. It's very difficult to manage that psychologically. So, in terms of my poetry, 128 Farley Road, that is inhabited by dead girls in the walls and other things that have been forgotten. In abuse, you get fragmented memory, can't remember stuff, and that is an ongoing thing. Maybe for life, your memory is skewed because it affects how your brain operates. And in the last line of the poem, you have a voice that speaks to a dead body, which says, "I know the rules, no names, no dates, just numbers." And I knew for sure that I was going to break those rules. I was going to name names, and I wanted to resurrect the dead and bring them back to life through poetry and through the voice. So that's Farley Road. Yeah.
I'm not sure I want to visit, but the voices in the walls, it's really haunting, disturbing.
They are.
Yeah. But I mean, there's an interesting thing that struck me in the poems, and you've just raised it here, which is how your speaker and the narrative are able to jump abruptly, but seamlessly, between the metaphorical and the practical. And here I'm referring to the vitamin D deficiency you mentioned just now. This seems central to your narrative strategy and to the character's survival, as you say. So can you tell me about tell us about your voice and how that's changed or not?
Yeah.
And then a bit about the characters, perhaps.
Yeah, it's really having to keep up with myself, Jeffrey. It's really, You know, I don't know what's happening from one thing to another with stuff, this voice change. But I do now know, again, since publishing and since writing it and since talking to you and since being in the group, I know so much more about what I'm doing. But before, you know, you skirt around the edges. But I'd not noticed the metaphorical, you know, the vitamin D thing. I'd not noticed the metaphorical and practical leap. So thank you for that. I'm going to be probably looking that up a lot. But regarding the voice change, initially that was a mystery, as I said. And gradually I've come to see that the narrative form created a distance which was useful. You know, I'm a lyric poet, as you saw in Left to Hang, you know, I'm a lyric poet by default. And then I tend towards the experimental free verse and approach subjects by going in slant. But this writing, you know, that just suddenly happened in pretty much last year or maybe the year before, was radically different. It was narrative, it was direct, it employed characters, and it had a plot. And I didn't know what to do with that. I'm not a novelist. I didn't know what to do with it. And so, so I just went with it. And I learned through the characters that not only was I able to reenact the past, but to also to understand what happened and speak about it. And although in these poems, the boundaries are between reality and fiction are very blurred. So I think the narrative thing was the lyric fragmentation is one way of the voices, the inner characters, and the narrative voice is bringing the coherence together and being able to tell the story. And Crystal was one of the characters that came up, and the only reality to Crystal is that I did know someone called Crystal who was in a massage parlour in Cambridge Circus or Soho, wherever we were involved. I think she had white curly hair or something. But that's all I remember of her. She was one of the first characters on the scene, and she was fierce and feisty, and I admired her with great caution. She's a scary person, but she's a nice person. Anyway, she has her own voice, and she demanded she be featured in her own book. So it was all that I was trying to get a collection together, but she said, no, you're going to put me in a pamphlet. And I obliged. I produced a pamphlet, but she was very unhappy about having to share the space with the other characters. She wasn't happy, and so she refused to talk to me, which was worrying. In fact, actually, she got so angry that she actually turned on me and on the other character in the book, which comes out in Switchblades. And switching is very integral in prostitution as well. So she did that. But by then I'd got the bulk of the pamphlet ready, so I was able to carry on. And she's sort of talking to me again because she knows she's going to feature in the next collection. So she's sort of talking to me again quietly. But anyway, we have an intense relationship, a very complicated dynamic. Yeah, that's Crystal. But there are other, she's not the only one, she's got other characters in there. And that's that really.
That's that, yeah. I think they and you will have a lot more to say. I certainly look forward to hearing it. You're a hard act to follow, especially, I mean, I still admire April. Why do I keep saying April? April's my psychotherapist.
Oh.
I mean Alice. I'm just so amazed that Alice saw to put you and I together in this program, because it's just been a fantastic experience. So I will now read some poems from my pamphlet, Dear Friends, and some newer work as well. So as I was saying, I mean, the discussions we've had have been really great. So thank you. Let me get my poems up here. So I'm going to begin with a poem, a long poem, which many in the pamphlet are. So I'll only read the first part of it. It's called Vegas, the Wanderer. So it started at home with orange blossom and the blistering sun, not paradise entirely. Lily would clean room by room, the living room, the Florida room, the hard tile floor in the kitchen, while I sat and soaked in all the sadness of the house. She'd pause to squeeze out the sponge of me and fill her deep, bright pail with heavy gray water. Then the bedrooms, mine with its sturdy bed but broken spring mattress, the stained sheets she cleaned daily, no words spoken, no sign. When time came to drive her home, I'd be waiting to jump in the car next to her and travel across town to watch those long, slow freight trains that seemed to go on forever, seemed to stop everything from moving to the other side. My father, he always signed his letters, "Your devoted father." Mother? Well, in Lily's words, "Now, Lord, ain't she a handful?" You can also start here. Lily's shadowed lawn, at home where she worked after work, taking refuge out of the Florida heat, grew her brilliant orange lilies under the jasmine and live oaks, the bed of blue plumbago. Then there were the signs. Stay off the lawn, no coloreds or Jews allowed. Begin again. So the second poem I'm going to read isn't from the pamphlet, but it's on similar themes. Just mention that formally it's a double sonnet, and the name of the poem plays on that. And if you want to call it the sonnet turn, is between the first and second sonnets, where the poem actually moves from third person to first person. Second harvest. He was born into a house of half-silvered mirrors, whispers behind doors, valenced curtains, cut glass chandeliers. His mother in hospital unmoving. His father at home with a cavalier gaze. Stranded, poor man, in love with men he could not touch. Seemed intent on living his son's life. Their home was full with scolding, loveless, but for Lily in the kitchen cooking, where she'd pause to dry tears from the boy's constant eyes. 2 years before he felt his mother's touch, and she, so often sick in bed, grew cold and cunning. He'd have wriggled away, but serpents remained coiled inside him. I was soft then, but now my first harvest gathered in from rough places and rougher boys, with a thirst for tongues and willing cocks, our bodies chafing on the blades of St. Augustine grass. I've learnt with them at last to love. What to say to that boy I lay myself down to each night, wanting to fill a void that's long since been filled. Looking in, absence is what I see, what he may always see. Turn your gaze, I tell him. Look again. Those lawns have grown to meadows now, where we've been loved by so many men. Our father could trade only glances and old torchères, which cast faint heat on portraits no one touched. And this poem is also outside the pamphlet, continuing the same things, but specifically how love is learned and passed on. and how that is very often from unexpected places. The poem's also very much about finding kinship and the sad inverse of that, which is otherness. Other work. A great cast iron pot, and inside it, the dark ruby mud of sauce from a recipe I make 50 years on. Its piquant smell taking me back to Lily May in the kitchen, cooking thinnest escallops of veal to dress in ripe tomato mantas, a recipe my grandmother had taught her, my mother too sick to cook. Lily May, her warm smile in that too hot Florida kitchen, the sheen of sweat on her black skin, and otherness that felt like kindness to me. Lily, scattering the gem sparkle finish of basil on a field of Parmesan, a cliche of labor, maybe of love, like the taste of salt and tang of oregano there on your lips when we kissed the first time I made Parmigiana in your kitchen, which quickly became ours, to others. The pot steaming on the stove, young men building their home together. Have to take a deep breath after that. I'm going to now move forward in years. Those poems were all in some way inspired by my childhood. This is from the long central poem of my pamphlet, but I'll only be reading the first 4 parts. It's an elegy to my best friend of the time, Thomas Jarling, who died from AIDS in its earliest years of the epidemic. It was 1993 and he was only 36 years old. And of course, it's also an elegy for all that was lost and continues to be lost to the disease. Dear friend, I am writing this to you. No, I'm writing this for us. If you're there, please listen. No echoes, no woofs. It's winter now, and the world's shut down, our half of it, that is, or here. Silence all around, but for the urge. Where are you? Where the fuck are you? All of you. Which of the cats ambling in my garden's warmth today is you? Which hummock your grave? What grass shields those once soft curls, the flesh? In which hospital did you die? Which room, or was it hospice? Who wept in that city of presidents we loathed? I went quiet, the escape. It wasn't from you. Orpheus, I've dared to look back. For it's how I wanted you in the photos, as in what I'd have said if it weren't all so terribly hidden or lost. We bent our bodies blindly, couldn't imagine secrets blooming like lesions. That spring, as in any other year, fruit trees laden with flowers, the bees crazed with hunger, some falling like sharp tears. But innocence, it really has nothing to do with this. Dear Tom, your father won't know you, won't want to, the way I did. And him, I didn't know him either, except what he filled you with, what you became. And though he'd never admit it, filled your mother with the seed to rear up that beautiful trunk, native, crimson. You made a fire of me, more than any man I'd ever touched. And you were good as a cool, damp towel on fire. So increasingly, and Chaucer and I spoke about this a lot and really helped reveal it to me in some ways, that I see my poetry as a process of writing out of darkness. And this next poem is the most literal one I've written on that idea. It's from a sequence of poems in Dear Friends entitled Gallery. There's one Americanism in the poem, which maybe I should explain. It's Zenith, or Zenith, which was a brand of black and white television, which had a logo which is described in the poem. And they were very popular in the 1960s. Still life with peacocks. He looks to the surface of darkness, a room so deep no one sees through. Outside, the fattened moon, faint in a burning sky, sings the lapping waves where with dolphins he'd learnt to swim, free to dive great depths, not to be seen as he is in the dark. He could be heard breathing should anyone stop to listen. Allí, caballero amigo, a black tin knight, much older than he, stands guard. Their only light, a 9-pointed colored glass piñata, waiting to splinter into stars. A colorless TV with plastic knobs, a bright bolt of lightning marked Zenith. There are petit point headboards his grandmother made, and quilting to keep them warm at night. Winter's brief but bitter beyond the shuttered windows he knows so well. Give on to geckos and sand ants, a dense pointed screen of palmetto, and a steep ladder from which to drop down his body, life, shade and color of feather. Its barbs, words etched in sand, no different than the burnish of sun, brilliant as peacocks. So I'm now going to read one last piece from the pamphlet. It's the last section of a long poem, or longish poem. Chaucer especially asked that I read it, and if I'm honest, it's actually one of my favorite passages. The poem is entitled Animal Etudes, and it's seven different variations on animals. Those cats, carrying in them so many bodies, the souls of lost friends, lovers, men with undisclosed names. Those cats, those tricksters. I don't mean to get all crazy here with spirituality. So let's just call them memories. So porous, so life up in the garden, those cats. I can't look at them now. Perhaps because I can't see them without seeing you dead someday. Not this day, but I've a devious mind. It likes to anticipate life in fantastic ways. And yes, sometimes, most times it seems, storms, wounds of the flesh, and souls. There, those souls again, those sweet cats that move with the elegance of you inside me. I have one last poem, and it's also one of my most recent poems. And while it definitely acknowledges current events, it's more about what is lost over time in the course of any lifetime. Just to say that the title is actually written as one long word, and it's, but what is time now? Sluggish islands in a spiritless sea, fields tended by somnambulant animals. If only London would wheel out its tent and open the circus again, then I'd dare. Some momentary lapse from isolation of decorum, I'd hold you, close as this page alone allows. no wave or epidemic to take us. I am autumn, after all, green no longer, and set nature aside this hushed past September. Two youngish lads have alighted from our once October train, casual, so tracksuits and jerseys on this brilliant November morning. Slim, fleet. I think of what I'd once been, or how I'd seen myself then. Remember? On the train, one had taken the other's hand gently, stroked his back. Why tell you this now? Then pressed a knee to his leg. Both of them slouched in the carriage's hard back seats, yet eager, hot. I think how they'd have fucked this morning in a translucent haze. I've picked up the seasons again. A glorious heated Naples yellow blows from August is welcome. What use is waking, you ask? Cat's eyes in moonstone, startling beauty, I mean to say. I too am exhausted, but will return to our compassed field laid bare. All I have is phases yearning to be emphatic. How fragmented I am, where to fall. So thank you very much for this opportunity to read those poems.
That was great. That was just great hearing them all together. And that last one, that last poem, the train and the boys coming off, and time, you know, the way that you write about time, and then you go into the autumn. Yeah, it's incredible the way that you I really love the way that you put those together. And there are, oh, you know, and the interjection, you know, why tell you this now, you know, I like the way that you interject and use that other voice as well. And it was really nice to hear them read. I appreciate your work so much, for loads of reasons. For me subjectively as a reader, your work touched me profoundly. It enabled me to find a previously inaccessible connection to my dad, you know, to my father. He was a passionate dahlia grower and was always in the garden with flowers and dinner plate dahlias and pom-poms and that. Anyway, I didn't have too much of a connection, but I got a connection with him now. And he's with me after reading your poems. I found that by reading your work with its focus on flora and fauna and the intensity of colour, it was as if my father rose from the dead and he's still with me today. So I hope we can learn a bit more about, you know, how you achieve this through your poetry. How do you do it, and its process, and bringing things out into the open and into the light, which I think we have a bit of common, you know, in common in our work, but you do it so differently and so beautifully. So I'd like to start by asking you about your life as a young Jeffery, as a young person. What reading, viewing, and recreational influences did you have around? Because you've clearly informed and enabled, you know, they've clearly informed and enabled your writing to write in such a beautifully extraordinary way. So I want to know more. Jeffery.
Thank you, Chaucer. I don't know. I think maybe I have to give some kind of audience warning, because there's going to be a heavy dose of autobiography here. So, let's see if we can unpack this a little bit. I mean, sometimes it's as much a mystery to me, but you've actually helped me understand my own work better. So my childhood was really very solitary, despite having a brother, but he was 6.5 years older than me. My mother, as you can probably tell, had multiple sclerosis and was often bedridden. And my father worked very long, odd hours. My mom's MS struck catastrophically whilst giving birth to me. So she was in hospital for much of the first 2 years of my life. And initially she was paralyzed and blind. I never saw that, of course. She had an amazing recovery and through much of my childhood functioned fairly well, but her initial absence had a profound effect. And I think probably informs almost everything I write. Then there is the counter to that, which is that we had a Black housekeeper, Lily May, who was the most consistent and loving presence in my childhood. And since you ask, in addition to the love she gave, she imparted a joy of food and cooking, and a competence that also was really empowering. So that comes up in the poetry. But from early on in my writing, I felt a need to acknowledge what she gave, to honor that, and her. As a Black woman in the South in the 1960s, as you can imagine, she was largely ignored or worse. And that was even in my house as well as outside. In some poems like Other Work, which I read, I think it's clear I not only loved and feel indebted to Lily, but I felt a kinship with her. And the shame I felt and feel at how she was treated has become a key subject for me. I have a real desire to make amends to her and to others who are diminished by their difference, and the discrimination that they feel. And to celebrate and elegize them, especially those who are significant in my life, because I can write more personally about it. It's not that I don't care about others. But as you'll see, and we're going to talk about in the exercise, it's important for me to write from experience. And thus, the pamphlet came, Dear Friends, as well as my interest in poems of direct address. Reading was really important, as you might imagine, but difficult because I also have ADD, attention deficit disorder, and I'm a very, very slow reader. Still, I loved English novels, especially Thomas Hardy and Charles Dickens. So I guess the darkness and melancholy have been themes with me from early days. But interestingly, fairy tales and children's stories, except for Dr. Seuss, I guess, which I loved, and maybe that also shows in my poetry, were almost entirely absent because my parents were rarely there to read. I'd like to bring fables and fairy tales into my poetry, but I don't feel comfortable with it. And I think that also has to do with an insecurity and fear around childhood play. And I think the poetry and writing generally actually developed as a sort of surrogate, as a form of mature play. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's only after having written poetry seriously for 10 years or so now that I felt confident to start playing backwards, I like to think of it, into childhood darkness. I love what Caroline Bird says somewhat in that regard about poetry, that it's a sentimental act, but the poem can't be sentimental. To make a poem, we have to go into the forest exposed. And she's quoting from James Tate there. So as I mentioned earlier, increasingly I view what I'm doing as a desire to write out of darkness, both the place of darkness and the journey out. And that's the redemptive power of poetry, shading of light and dark. Also specifically the vulnerability of children in difficult families, illness, etc. And how we carry that through life seems to me key. And giving witness to that also gives the poetry meaning to me. And that poem I read, Still Life with Peacocks, is a fairly explicit example, as I said. So in our conversations, we talked a lot about place, as you sort of heard in our earlier conversation. So yes, the flora and fauna of exotic Florida were a real delight. And they still inspire me, obviously, and I think they communicate a lot to the reader. I'd spend hours sequestered in our large garden. It was one of the few places I felt really safe. And it was also a connection to my father, who loved plants. And I was fascinated by the speed and grace, which I had none of, the geckos, but terrified by crocodiles and tarantulas, surprise, surprise, and sports. So thinking of our earlier discussion about place, I'm sort of fascinated by how it and memories can spur the imagination. And maybe that's how these poems are actually working on you. Also how place can mark our developmental lives in time, and especially in relationship to home and childhood. I eventually chose to become an architect and urban and environmental designer, largely because place and the landscape were so important to me as a child. Let's see, what else did we, well, to go on about the playground, it felt like a place of great danger and harm to me. I was really clumsy with my ADD, and I was chubby, so there was body dysphoria and all that stuff. But mostly from an early age, I was aware of an unwanted desire for the company of other boys, and I was shunned and bullied, so I kept my distance. But I was very lucky. The danger I felt was implied or anticipated. I was rarely physically bullied, and never violently, like the women that you write about. And it would be very difficult for me. I often think about it because there are other queer writers who do write about violence, but it would be very difficult for me. But still, as I hope is available in the poems, that fear was really crushing. I do think it's sort of at the heart of my writing. It's among the reasons for balancing optimism and beauty, I guess, with darkness. But the boundaries are really less defined than we feel as children. Most everyone is curious. So I'm going to read a very short poem here that speaks to that. Schooling. The schoolyard gate swings. Even then I could see beauty. In the buzz-cut boy, the chiseled smile in his stony face. Even then, he knew what I wanted.
Wow. Yeah. I love that short poem. It's a real nugget of a poem. It's chilling. It is really chilling poem. There's so much in it, and yet it's so spare. You've got your 7 lines, your enjambment, and you think, oh, there's hardly anything there, but there really is. And as gay people, or queer, or whatever, whichever terminology is used, I think we know that. A lot of people know that inherent fear, and it's all out there, isn't it? And the other thing, before I go on to the question, is the fairy tale things that you bring up, that, just carry on writing, with the fairy tale thing, because the block that you had with that, because they weren't there to read to you and stuff, and you don't feel as if you can write through that because of that. Just mind you, I know what that's like, so I need to do it myself, but yeah. So
well, you did discover a new voice to do it, and I think that may be part of it, but yeah, that's instructive.
Absolutely. Yeah, nail on the head again. Absolutely. Yeah, I have the block with myth because of the therapy, blocking. I can't access myth and Roman and Greek myth, and you've got the fairy tale thing, and I just think, yeah, it'd be very interesting to see how you get through that and how we get through that. You know, perhaps we can get through that then together somehow.
Yeah.
A two-part question. I'd now like to ask you in depth a bit more, how instructive or directive or otherwise were your parents and family in relation to the architect and designer that you became, and in relation to your language and your use of diction, which could be described as, you know, you've done it yourself and other people, I think, Bad Betty or something, described as ornate, whereas I describe it as extraordinarily idiosyncratic and a striking way of juxtaposing dark and light. I'd like to ask you, you know, how intuitive was that, and how conscious you are of those shifts? Can you you know, like, give us a hint of your process so that we can do it?
Well, it started out quite intuitively, but you know, I think I've certainly come to realize that writing poetry is a sort of process of increasing self-awareness, both about ourselves and about our craft. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, my parents loved art and were art collectors. I was surrounded by the stuff almost to suffocation sometimes, but of course it was a fabulous, you know, visual world. And so that's informed it. But I've often felt a kind of liability from it because I feel like it's something I've had to master. Anyway, that reminds me of Wallace Stevens, who's one of my favorite poets, and heavily influences me. He was known to have to do the same. So, but the interesting thing is, even now, I'm really surprised how aware I am of my mother's influence regarding language. She had been an actress before she developed MS, and she was very theatrical with language as well as behavior. Yeah, I mean, the other thing is that, you know, those artworks, they became a material barrier between me and my parents, and they were almost fetishistic. So, you know, I look at them with some, you know, with some skepticism, I guess, but still with, you know, with great love. And they're just a very fertile field of metaphor. We'll talk about that a bit in the exercises if we get to them at this point. It's going on so long.
Yeah.
Alice, how are we doing?
Time.
Yeah, we should probably, we're over the hour by 20 minutes, so we should probably do the exercises quite soon now. But it's been a fantastic event. I mean, it's amazing reading, amazing questions. But yeah, I think because it's a school night, we should probably go to the exercises if that's okay.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to say, I guess, two quick things. You know, obviously, all of the prescriptions that I had in childhood, my parents didn't want me to be an architect or anything. You know, it was sort of capped by, you know, the forbidden boys. And because I'm going to be reading a poem at the end that's relevant to this, it's just that I've become increasingly aware as I'm older that, you know, the thing that was most loved was also the thing that was forbidden. So that we came to fear what we loved most. I mean, you know, the boys and men that I'm attracted to. And it's true of, you know, true in, you know, other aspects of one's life too. Yeah, I guess there was just one last thing that we had talked about a lot, which was about form in poetry. And it is really important to me. I mentioned that I have ADD as well. And so writing was always a way to actually anchor experience. And so the putting of something into, the putting of words and experience into a sort of two-dimensional form on the page is really critical to me. And so I'm very precise about it. Anyway, that we could go on for a long time. So Chaucer, do you want to do your exercise? So other people can learn to talk too much.
That was really interesting. Everything was really interesting.
Thank you.
My internet went unstable then, so some of it I missed. If it froze. I hope you can hear me because it's coming up unstable.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Okay. I'll do the exercise then. So bear with me because I'm not used to doing poetry exercises. I'm more film exercises. But anyway, my exercise. Right. So if everybody can get a pen and paper and what I'd like you to do is look around your immediate area. Don't go out anywhere. Just look around your immediate area and find a couple of objects that you feel are flawed in some way, that make you feel uncomfortable or annoy you. I mean, I don't know if this pen works, so that's annoying. And then write a list of words that describe that negative feeling. So find a couple of objects and describe what feeling comes up if you find that they're flawed. And I'll give you 3 minutes for that. So if I hope I put this bit in, a list of words that describe that negative feeling. It's coming up to about 3 minutes. So if you've got a list of the words now, either in a column or opposite along, vertically or horizontally, and then now you've got your list of words, can you put those words into lines? So just connective, greasy, broken plate, sort of greasy and broken. And so you've got a plate that's greasy and broken. So the greasy, broken plate, something like that. So you've got some lines with those words in and you've connected them up. So I'm going to give you a minute because you've got your words. So I'll give you a minute for that. I hope that's a minute. Now you've got the words and the lines. I'm going to give you another minute, 1 minute, to think of as many song titles as you can think of. So just suddenly think of as many song titles as you can possibly think of in a minute. Okay, now do the same thing with the objects that you've found, whatever objects they are. Make a list of words and lines and put them into lines, but look at them from another perspective. So if you find that hard to switch from one perspective to another, just imagine that your object or the objects that you've got that are negative, that they've been stolen and taken away from you, ripped away, and you can't find them anymore. So you've got all these negative things on this object, and somebody comes in and takes it away, and then returns it to you. And what would you say? How would you feel? What would you think of that object? And I'll give you 3 minutes to do that. So you've got your returned object. Okay. By now you should have got some lines and some words and stuff. And basically, really, that's it. The song exercises could be used as titles or integrated into the poem. But has anybody got anything from that at all? Oh, no. You're muted. Oh, you have.
Do anyone, if you'd like to comment, please just unmute yourself. You know, do speak up and say if you got something from this.
Yeah, whatever you've got.
I love the idea of writing something negative and then realizing the reality of something being stolen from you and the way you reevaluate. I think that's a really beautiful way to think about things and to reimagine them, because actually part of me thought, oh my God, I look down on these things that I use every day, but if they were to leave me, I'd be really miserable and very irritated. So I love that as a way of thinking about things. Yeah.
If anybody's got anything to read, and that's fine. And I know we going with time and stuff. Yeah. Or not, we can move on to Jeffrey's exercise.
It was a great exercise. Thank you so much, Chaucer. Really interesting, and I think great to focus on the specifics. And at a time when we can't travel to Rome or see a sort of sunset off Cornwall, to actually work with the small and the local is really useful. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah.
I'd like to second what Annie said in how that works to really pivot your headspace for something, but also, yeah, like you're saying, Alice, it's so small, but actually it's so relevant to what we're all feeling at the moment as well, with what we can and cannot do. I thought it was really interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Right, Jeff, do you want your exercise now?
Yeah. So now for something not completely different. So we're going to look at two things. One is lexicon, your own unique voice that comes from it. And then the writing of poems of direct address. So those of you who did the exercise, did anybody do the exercise that was sent around, which was to skim through 4 or 5 of your poems, whatever, and highlight the sort of notable words? Yes, no? Well, that's okay. If you did, you've got more material. If you didn't, then we're going to do something else here, which is, yeah, I've already talked about, heightened language, but there's also simple language too. We should also remember that words like, for me, really and after are part of our own particular lexicon. Really, for me, I think is a signal of questioning, and after reflects a strong interest in how the past is always present. So these words too can also become really distinctive. So what I'd like you to do now is to think of a metaphor for ourselves today, how you are right now, and specifically a flower. If you were a flower, what flower would you be? And write it down with as many words quickly to describe it, or describe you as the flower. You can ascribe a mood to the flower, maybe using color or smell, the setting of the flower, its seasonality, symbolism in our cultures. So, and let's just take 3 minutes to do that. So as we are running really quite late here, is everybody feeling like they've got some words that are unique to you? Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is actually do a short bit of writing, 5-7 minutes in direct address. And so I just want to say, I mean, there are various ways of writing in direct address. You can be very explicit, or it can be indirect. And the direct address can even be withheld until late in the poem, or perhaps the addressee is never identified. But I think the great value of doing it is that when we write in direct address to someone, to a specific you, we write more personally and directly, and using our most distinctive and intimate language is a way of doing that. And yeah, I find that writing in direct address has really helped me be much clearer in my writing, which has always been important, because with the ADD and being gay, I've spent much of my life obscuring intentions and emotions. So what else did I want to say? It's even if the reader never knows who's being addressed, the more personal language you use, the more likely the reader will be, I think, to identify and empathize. And that's true even, this has really become interesting to me, I might try it myself, is that even if the language is largely unintelligible to the reader, it seems to me then we definitely know the uniqueness of the bond between the speaker and the subject. So there are other ways to do this, like generic direct address, like letter to an editor or something. And I've got some poems here and links that I'll put in the chat so you can check them out if you want. But so what I want you to do now is, say 5-7 minutes without thinking too much, is to write in direct address to someone you believe you'll never see again or speak to again. And that could be a deceased person or a dying person, an ex-lover or spouse, someone with whom you've had a severe disagreement. It could be a sibling, it could be the butcher. It could be a pet or a past editor. But I want you to do that, and I want you to use as many of the words that you've come up with either in that exercise I sent around, which is really a useful one. If you haven't done it, I recommend it. Or in this flower metaphor that you've just done. So is that clear? Okay. We have 2 more minutes. So you should try and wrap up if you can. Really sorry that we've ended up overrunning so long. Don't have much time here. So would anybody like to say something about the exercise or share something that they've written?
Oh, I found it a really interesting exercise because I often get feedback that I rely too much on the same words. So I found it really fun to be able to rely only on those words.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Yeah, I think, the words we use over and over again. I mean, yeah, as I said before, you have to restrain yourself. But yeah, those are quite unique to your voice. So anybody else have anything, or do they want to read anything that they wrote? Is it helpful to write to someone you think you'll never see or speak to again?
I would just like to second that. I found 2 exercises really useful. I've got some nice notes I think I'm going to continue to work on. And Jeff, thank you for the exercise you sent round as well. The underlining was quite revealing.
Yeah.
Seeing words which perhaps I overuse sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, it's worthwhile to do it to also be aware of what you overuse. Those little words can be bothersome. But they are there. I mean, I think about it a lot because after and really, really show up a lot. Really is a bad one. Really, really bad. So, well, if does anyone else want to share anything or say anything? So we should probably move on. Alice, shall we just wrap up, or do you still want us to read a poem?
I think it's been a wonderful evening. Let's hear one poem each from you, and that would just be the perfect finale as far as I'm concerned.
Okay.
And then, it's been long, but it's been really special. I've got so much. I feel you've been very generous with your readings, your times, and your insights. And yeah, let's see you out with 2 beautiful poems.
Okay, well, I'm going to go first, and then Chaucer can finish off with her launch debut. This poem's entitled Shadows, for Thomas. From our risen state each Sunday morning, they've fallen. from sermons voiced to ourselves speaking in tongues and touch with an incumbent hesitance, some would call fear. Two paths awaken, dare and defense, desire and grace, sown ground, walked so damnably often. But today I have blindfolded myself to see more deeply. This is not metaphor. I am in a room of men, touching each of them and all of each of them, mind, spirit, sex. Our blindness is mutual, yet so thinly formed we fall together, willing, without surface. From others I learned to look down, to not be seen, forbidden to see my life in quavers of shadows. And in those hours of blindness, I understood what and who I loved could not be terrible. And I buried those harsh and ghostly voices. Thank you. It's really a pleasure to do this with you all tonight. Thank you very much.
Okay, all right. I'll finish off with this poem. This final poem is the title poem of the book. It's what I call Crystal's Manifesto. And it's called In an Ideal World, I'd Not Be Murdered. In an ideal world, I'd buy a bigger place, a place where us girls could work together. There's safety in numbers, not afraid of getting busted or being murdered. I refuse to compromise my safety, said Crystal, inviting strangers back to her room. But nights were always hard for Crystal. There's a safety in jeopardy, ain't there? Crystal loved art. Her bedsit covered in posters from the 60s, blondes, semi-nudes, mostly murdered women. Her favourite chair, just a knockoff imitation, she called her Keeler chair. Crystal could have been a hoarder, but in fact she was a hooker. She was lucky, never murdered. She understood erasure, turned it into art forms, pinned it to the walls. Crystal knew what she wanted, and that was somewhere quiet. But not so quiet, I get murdered. And then she'd giggle and try to disarm you with laughter. But not really. That's it.
Thank you so much. It's been an incredible evening. By Jeff's book, Dear Friends, by Chaucer's soon to be nearly out, In an Ideal World, I'd Not Be Murdered, from Against the Grain. And is that the real deal? I'm waiting for mine to arrive.
Yeah.
And, you know, you've been an amazing pair of poets. We've voiced our silences very, very comprehensively. And I can't thank you enough on behalf of all of us. So thank you so much. And we'll just close by on a gallery view of everyone clapping.